lovely warm welcome. I'm Stan Grant and we're coming to you live from Melbourne tonight. Joining me on the panel, lecturer in digital cultures at the University of Sydney, Olga Boichak. Liberal member for Mackellar, Jason Falinski. Former Director General of ASIO, Dennis Richardson. Shadow Minister for Defence, Brendan O'Connor. And from Sydney, senior writer from the Sydney Morning Herald, Deborah Snow.
Thank you, Stan. I'm just wondering, how will history judge this extraordinary week?
Good question, because it has been an extraordinary week. And Olga, for you as a Ukrainian, watching what's happening, having friends and family there, what's going through your mind?
Thank you, Stan, and thank you, Christina, for your question. I am not a historian, but as a Ukrainian, I can remember instances in history when Ukraine was being exterminated, when Ukraine was under attack, and we can go back to the 1933 and 32. We can go back to when Putin first started the war in 2014. And so right now, I am also thinking that this is a very pivotal moment. We are living through the 8th day of the occupation of Ukraine by Russia, of a full-scale occupation. And it is extremely hard for me as a Ukrainian to witness my country being destroyed from afar. And so right now we see a lot, we see that Putin is bombing civilians, we see that he's committing war crimes, we see that he is bombing universities, hospitals, and this is just devastating. This is really concerning, and I guess my question when I'm watching it all from here in Australia is, when will it stop? You know, when will be that point when something will be done? So we see the world supporting Ukraine as much as they can, but also historically we know that sometimes this support wasn't enough, and sometimes this support didn't come in time. And so I guess this is a broader question about the value of human lives that are being lost right now in Ukraine, and what do we as the society value in, you know, when will we think that this is enough and what can be done?
And certainly a lot of that we're going to be unpacking throughout the program. A lot of questions go to that. Dennis Richardson, when you look at this, and with your long history and of course your long involvement in issues such as this, what does it speak to you in terms of what we are seeing playing out and how it will be defining this era or be remembered?
Well, I think in terms of the past week, we're witnessing one of the great watersheds in Europe. We had the two great wars of the last century. We had the Cold War, followed by the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s. This is the next great watershed in Europe on from there. Now, what that means in terms of history, we'll have to wait and see. But Putin has made a big strategic play. I think he may not have expected the NATO countries to be as unified as what they are. They clearly plan their sanctions carefully. They'll take a long while to bite. But you asked in your opening introduction, Stan, why are they standing alone? Well, overnight, 135 member countries of the 193 members of the United Nations voted outright to condemn Russia for its invasion. 35 countries abstained, and 4 countries voted with Russia: North Korea, Syria, Eritrea, and next door to Russia, Belarus. Now, if your four friends in the world are Belarus, North Korea, Syria, and Eritrea, you've got a problem.
Deborah Snow, former Moscow correspondent, to watch all of this play out, what does it say to you about this moment?
Well, I agree with Dennis. It's a massive watershed moment. One doesn't like to think about worst-case scenarios, but already we've had talk out of the Kremlin about putting their nuclear forces on some kind of alert. One hopes that's bluff. there has to be. I desperately hope that behind the scenes of what's going on with the UN and the European Parliament and so on, that back channels are still open. I hope for Europe's sake, for the world's sake, also for Ukraine's sake and for Russia's sake, that back channels are still open somewhere. Because if this keeps going, towards increasingly grave scenarios, then it's a very perilous moment, not just for Europe, but for the world.
Jason Falinski.
Well, Stan, I agree with everyone on the panel. I think what this is really about is, and it may turn out to be a hinge moment in history, because for the last 7 decades we've had a global world order based on the rule of law. What is happening at the moment is you have authoritarian regimes, both in Russia and elsewhere, pushing that law to the side and trying to assert that if you have the military capability, then you are able to assert yourself over smaller and less powerful neighbours. If we are to maintain Western order and a sense of an international order based on law, this has to be the moment when the West stands up and assertively pushes back on an aggressor. Because we saw in Crimea, we've seen in Syria and in other places that when we don't, it simply escalates to the next moment. And I think in our region, we have authoritarian players who will be looking at this, not in the short term, but in the medium to long term, about determining whether the West has the will to continue to maintain an international order based on law.
Christine, I want to come back to you in just a moment because, of course, you're involved with the Ukraine community here. But I'll just get a comment from you, Brendan, before I do, and flip that a little bit, picking up on what Jason has said. What it says about Russia this week, but what it says about the West and the ability to meet an authoritarian threat. What do you take away from this week?
Well, I think, look, it's been a tragic week, and history will judge this week, as Dennis said, as a watershed. However, we don't know how this is going to unfold. And an optimistic view is that because of the scale of the response of condemnation by the European Union, the United States, Canada, Australia and other countries, I think that at least, let's hope, will mean that President Putin will be rethinking his position. And as has been said, we would hope that there would be some lines of communication open still. And it's one of the reasons we haven't, for example, dismissed the ambassador of Russia, because however odious it might seem, ongoing communication with the Russian state may be our best hope in preventing the escalation. But in escalation of this matter, now it's hard to say to Ukrainians it could get worse than this, but frankly it could get worse than this, and therefore every effort has to be made to prevent that from happening, and hopefully there'll be some cessation of conduct by Russia towards Ukraine.
Christina, you are the executive of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisations, so yes. I want to ask you about that and how the community is feeling and how they're coming together. Olga said how difficult it is to watch on. What's it been like for you? This last 7 days have been extraordinary, Stan. Leading up to it, there was a lot of discussion. What will it be tomorrow? As Australian Ukrainians, we're living it from afar, as Olga said, but for our family and friends that are living in Ukraine, they were living on the edge and living, going to school, going to work, kids going out and playing in the playgrounds, planning their holidays. And literally at 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon our time, I picked up the phone and rang friends and family and said, 2 words, Stan, it started. I woke friends and family and said, it started. And you could hear them waking, and it was very emotional. How's the Ukrainian community come together? We're a nation of fighters, as you're seeing what's happening on the ground at the moment. 40 million people over there are doing all that they can. Initially when this war started, because of course the war's been going for 8 years, when this invasion started, they showed a lot on television of the mass exodus of people, the cars leaving. But
a hell of a lot of people are still there, and they're fighting because they are determined that they will not give up that soil, they will not give up that land that is theirs. It is not Russian, it is Ukrainian. So how are we pulling together? We've had rallies, we're pulling together with the government. The government, both sides of government have been absolutely amazing. I've been in wonderful meetings with both sides. The support has been tremendous, but we always have to say, please do more. Ukraine is fighting this on its own. Yes, now they're being weaponed up. Now there is being support. But with my involvement, Stan, I know, and you hear, has Red Cross arrived? We're hearing these questions every single day. Who else is there? Who is helping? I got a phone call today from a friend of a friend, and they said, we have family that are underneath an apartment in the basement, and there's shooting going all around, Stan, and they have no food and water, women. How can you help me? And I said, how can I help from Australia? How can I help these women get food and water in a basement of an apartment building just outside of Kyiv?
Hi, my name is Irena, and I'm from Lviv. My home, my land, my nation is Ukraine, where I don't feel safe anymore. Our land is crying because even children are dying. We have good leaders now. We have an army I'm really proud of, but we cannot protect ourselves from the bombs and rockets, and the sky has become our enemy. Please tell me, why NATO is not helping us right now by closing the sky? At least this is 21st century. Thousands of people are now homeless in our country, or even dead or injured. What kind of world do we live in, not stopping it? Please explain. Thank you.
Yeah, Brenton O'Connor, I'll go to you on this. After the election this year, depending on the outcome, you may well be Defence Minister. These will be the questions that will be landing on your desk. And when we look around, and we've been hearing this, yes, NATO is supporting, yes, the US is supporting, but they have said absolutely we will not put troops on the ground. The US will not spill blood to defend Ukrainians on their soil. And you hear this question a lot. Why not?
Well, I think firstly, it's not just whether, in fact, the United States wants to invest more in this conflict for its own domestic purposes. For example, President Biden may well be concerned about what people at home would be thinking about insofar as US involvement. But it's also about a calculation about how Putin would respond if NATO countries were involved in a military conflict. Now, that is really ratcheting up and escalating the conflict, which could lead to untold, unknown consequences, but they would be dire. Now, I'm not saying that could not happen. Already we're concerned, of course, Poland being a neighbour of Ukraine, there could easily be an inadvertent incursion or assault on that country whilst Russia's attacking Ukraine. Now, at the moment, I think if you look at the extent of the support through military and lethal and non-lethal support, if you like, by NATO and by other countries, including Australia, I think that's the appropriate response.
But we're hearing it's not enough, Jason Falinski. We heard from Irina there in the question. Why not close the skies? What are other things that can be done, let alone going in and actually helping out on the ground?
Sorry, Brendan.
Can I just say, can I just say this, that as we are having this conversation, you can be assured of this, that national security agencies of countries involved in this matter would be considering all of these options. If you think about it, it's within a week.
Although the option has been taken off the table. Joe Biden has said we will not be doing that. He said it again in the State of the Union.
He did that for a good reason. He said in the State of Union address, if we are in conflict with Russia, it will be a world war, possibly nuclear exchange. So the reason why there is not a no-fly zone is because this is not Syria, this is not Iraq. To put a no-fly zone over the Ukraine against Russia would mean direct conflict with Russia, which would mean a wider war, which could mean a nuclear war.
And Jason, does that then not say to Vladimir Putin that he is an open door?
Stan, I go back to what I said earlier. I mean, Barack Obama stood up and said a red line in Syria is the use of chemical weapons. A year to the day, the Assad regime used chemical weapons and the United States did not respond. That sent a signal to authoritarian regimes around the world that Western governments were not willing to take the risk. Now, Germany opposed sending arms to Ukraine before this conflict began because they said it would be provocative.
It has now decided that it will commit to that. So we're seeing a change.
Now it has decided to do it. Now, Dennis is in a better position than I am to comment on this, and I suspect Olga is too. But I openly wonder whether if Germany was not so reliant on Russian gas, if that would still have been their view. There is no doubt by us not taking action earlier and not actually providing the support that the Ukrainians need, and by us I mean the West, if we have made this a less costless exercise for Vladimir Putin to undertake. Now that's a question for historians. But where we stand today is, Dennis is right, you cannot have direct conflict between the United States and Russia and the Russian Federation.
Well, Joe Biden has said that's a world war.
And the reasons for that are that it quickly escalates out of control. However, there are plenty of other things we can do to help the Ukrainians protect themselves and defend their sovereign nation.
Let me get a comment from Olga on that. Do you share the view of Irena there that the West could be doing more?
I do. In fact, I do, because I do agree that this was happening. We saw this coming. This buildup was escalating, and every time there were comments about tough guy diplomacy, about posturing on the part of Russia and the United States. And that makes me very angry, because people who made those comments have no stake. They have a privilege of sitting somewhere in Australia, in the West, and just saying that nothing will happen, it's not a real threat. We saw it happening, and it continued to build up. And as Christina said, once it started, it was already too late. And so I do think right now, my question to everyone, I guess, is there then a threshold where this will be a world war, right? How many Ukrainians have to die? How much has to be destroyed before the West steps up?
Where do you come down on the idea that there could be more the West could do, or would it be a provocation and a dangerous escalation?
I think it would be a mistake and a dangerous escalation. This isn't about putting troops on the ground in a war with Iraq or with Afghanistan. This is Russia, one of the biggest armies in the world, huge nuclear arsenal. We'd end up in a global war with the two biggest nuclear powers in the world, and suddenly we'd be going from what is really a regional conflict to a world war, which I just don't think is anybody's interest.
It's a hard one, isn't it? Because there are no, and we've heard tonight, and Dennis knows this well, there are no moral absolutes, there are just moral choices. And yet we know, as Olga said, people are going to die in Ukraine, a democracy, a sovereign country, and the world's biggest army is not going to have their back on the ground. These are really hard moral choices, aren't they?
Yeah.
Dennis, the question that Robin raises there is a real one, and that is this question of nuclear conflict. How real would that be?
Well, you could certainly paint a scenario where this conflict could unintentionally slip into a wider conflict leading to a nuclear war. Now, I don't think that will happen, but you could paint a scenario whereby Russia achieves its objective in the Ukraine, which is a puppet state of some sort. They either kill or imprison President Zelensky. Hopefully that does not happen. they take over that part of the Ukraine they want. That then leads to urban guerrilla warfare, with the guerrillas being supported, with the resistance being supported out of Poland and NATO. Russia over time becomes frustrated by that. Perhaps an accident happens somewhere between Poland and Russia, leading to a bigger conflict. You can't exclude that. I think Putin pulling the nuclear card out of his back pocket, as he did the other day, to my mind, was a sign of weakness, not of strength.
Deborah Snow, how do you feel about this? We listen to this and there are no easy answers and there are no good outcomes in any event. And that line between engagement or escalation is such a fine one. Where do you sit on that?
Well, I don't disagree with anything that's been said. I can really understand the frustration of the Ukrainians feeling that they're getting every kind of support except the kind of support they most want at the moment, which, as they have repeatedly said, is the enforcement of a no-fly zone over Ukraine to enable their very brave citizenry and their army to fight back as best they can without being pummeled from above by Russian forces. I really get that. I get the frustration among Western audiences that they want to see their governments doing more. But I very much agree with the scenario just sketched by Dennis. The moral choice is, you know, from an awful scenario to unthinkably bad scenarios. And that's why I say I hope back channels are open. By back channels, what I mean are ongoing forms of engagement between whatever part of the Kremlin still has some feelers out beyond its own sort of tight paranoid circle, and whatever form of diplomacy engagement is out there, whatever form of talks. I mean, there might have to be a face-saving accommodation reached. Both sides will probably have to give ground if there's going to be some kind of accommodation reached at some point. Now, it's too early to talk about that, I accept that.
That's the key, isn't it? Both sides having to give ground. And Olga, I think, is already looking askance at that. Olga, you're sceptical about that?
I am sceptical about that. I mean, Russia is a terrorist state. We do not negotiate with the Taliban, right? Why do we negotiate? Why do we keep treating Russia as if they haven't broken the norms of international law? That's just one comment. But the second comment, I was thinking about the nuclear threat and the threat of escalation, right? And Putin has enabled, so there's 4 levels of nuclear preparedness in Russia. He's now at level 2, so it's not yet, there's no red button for him to push on his table, but it's getting there, and he's doing it, of course, to deter any action, the enforcement of the no-fly zone. But there's a very real other nuclear threat on Ukraine's territory right now, and that is the Russian army having captured the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And they're weaponizing the radiation because right now when they're there, they can't be attacked. Nobody would shoot into that location. So while we're talking about metaphorical nuclear threats, which might materialize, might not, there is already a nuclear threat inside of the country that might realize.
Yeah, thank you, guys. So as someone who comes from the Russian community here in Australia, I've been pretty outraged by the narrative created by our media depicting the Ukraine as the good guy and Russia as the bad guy. Believe it or not, there are a lot of Russians here and around the world that support what Putin is doing in the Ukraine, myself included. Since 2014, the Ukrainian government, together with Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion, have besieged the Russian populations in the Donbass, killing an estimated 13,000 people, according to the United Nations.
That's a lie. That's a lie.
Could I finish?
Just quickly finish, and then we'll come to that and put that to the panel.
So my question is, where was your outpouring of grief and concern for those thousands of mostly Russians?
Okay. when you mention the 13,000, the United Nations has listed 13,000 total people killed since the conflict, but you're trying to suggest that is Russians killed by Ukrainians, and I think we need to point out that the United Nations has pointed out there is 13,000 killed since the conflict began in 2014. So we need to be very clear on that. Can I just put this now, leaving aside your personal views on this, can I just put that question, I'll go to you, Jason, on this. The idea that there is a moral equivalence or there is two sides, we know that Vladimir Putin has said that there were provocations as he sought, the encroachment and enlargement of NATO. He has claimed there is a genocide in the Donbass, which the evidence has not been presented to support that. But the allegation here that there are two sides of this or provocations that led to this, how do we look at this in its totality without diminishing what's happening on the ground and bring some... Is that possible?
It's really simple, Stan. There is no moral equivalency to murder. Just because someone is murdered does not give you the right to murder someone else. Secondly, the sovereignty of a nation cannot be simply wiped out because one individual decides without evidence that he's going to do that. And this is critical. We live in a world at the moment that is managed by rule of law. If we change that to a position where people just get to decide what they want to do because they've got more guns than the next person, that is not a world I want to live in. And I don't think it's a world anyone wants to live in.
Jason, can I also go to you on this point, and that is that you have Russian heritage yourself, and your grandparents come from the Soviet Union.
Well, my grandmother.
Your grandmother, but your grandparents came from the Soviet Union.
Well, no, it's very
anyway,
complex.
It's very families are complicated.
Section 44, you know, it's all on the public record.
But when you hear this, that there are Russians supporting Vladimir Putin, as we heard, how do you feel about that?
Well, I don't care. I don't care. There are international laws. And I mean, to your point, Stan, which goes to Dennis's point, there are no good endings to this. I mean, we sit here back in Australia and we go, well, one country's invaded another. That's wrong under international law. Let me tell you the people sitting in those countries. If you're Poland, you've had 1,000 years of people marching through your country, and for 600 years you were wiped off the map. How do you think the people of Poland are going to feel when you have Russian troops sitting on their border? The people of Latvia, of Lithuania, this is not going to end well unless the West is incredibly assertive about pushing back this unwarranted aggression.
Brendan.
Well, I think that there's a real question here about the misinformation that's deployed by Putin. Firstly, whilst no one's perfect, no independent state's without corruption or issues, of course. And Ukraine is a relatively young democracy, independence, I think 31 years. But Putin has been deploying misinformation for years. I mean, he is undemocratic by nature. He kills off his opposition. He uses all forms of propaganda. And what he's done here, is misrepresented the conflicts that have happened within the Ukraine to serve a purpose. The sort of false flag assaults where he contrives an attack and says it's Ukraine attacking dissidents in the Ukraine. Now, there might be occasions in which that conflict does happen, but it is also the case, and I believe the experts are right in suggesting that it is Putin that is quite often contriving these matters for his own purposes.
Sasha, people here have been talking about family who are suffering and people are dying, and I understand you wanted to ask your question about is there some reasoning for this, but you supported what's happening, hearing that people are dying, and can I just say I'm just not comfortable with you being here. Could you please leave? I've been... It's really... No, Sasha, I'm sorry. You can ask a question. You can ask a question, but we cannot advocate violence. I should have asked you to leave then. It's been playing on my mind, and I'm sorry, but I have to ask you to leave, please.
Okay, could I...
No, please. Just out of respect.
friends in Indepth.
Just no, please, we're not having the conversation, Sasha. We can't have people advocating violence. And I should have asked you to leave. It's been playing on my mind. I wanted to have a proper conversation about these things, but I have to ask you to leave. I'm really sorry. Okay, I'm sorry for that, but you know, these things happen. It's live television. You think about these things. It's really been troubling me that we can have a conversation and we can look at where the arguments are and we can try to look at the sides of the argument. We can't have that, and I'm sorry. It should have happened earlier. That's all we have time for, and thanks again to our panel, Olga Boichak, Jason Falinski, Dennis Richardson, Brendan O'Connor, and in Sydney, Deborah Snow. And thank you for your questions as well. Next week I'll be back with you live from Sydney. We're looking at power, politics and progress. So I'll be joined by podcaster and entrepreneur Lillian Flex-Mami Ahenken, businesswoman and educator Wendy McCarthy, refugee and gender policy advisor Najiba Vazivado, and founder and editor of online magazine Quillette, Claire Lemon. Until then, stay safe. Have a good night.